In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity. And welcome back to another week on the Catholic Toolbox, the Art of Practical Catholicism. I'm your host and founder, George Manassa, here as we equip you with practical tools to live your faith in our modern world of today. As we move 60 years on from the Second Vatican Council, I brought back here my good friend, Father Peter Williams, Vicar General of the Diocese of Parramatta. Welcome back, Father, to the show.
Thanks, George. Nice to be back.
It's great. And we had a great episode on the liturgy itself, and there was just so much to discuss there and unpack there on every aspect of the liturgy that we thought, we have to dedicate this episode to sacred music, because that's just a big area in and of itself. So looking 60 years after the Second Vatican Council on sacred music and where we've come from, and it's just absolutely amazing. And you recently had a diocesan conference on liturgy, I believe. How did that go?
Yes, we did. We had over 90 people at Marion last Saturday, or Saturday week ago, sorry. And it was a very successful day. And in fact, we had one of the workshops was on the subject of sacred music. And that was very led by Eric Grella, who's the Assistant Director of Music at the Cathedral here in Parramatta.
Excellent. And it's great to see people participating in bettering their understanding of the liturgy and the different aspects of the liturgy. Because as you mentioned last time, we need to educate people. That was one of the practical tools. We need to educate people about these things if we want change. And let's go straight into the topic. Music, where do we start? Where was music before the Second Vatican Council?
Sure. Well, let's actually go right back, because I think we need, in order to understand, I always say to my students at the Catholic Institute of Sydney, in order to understand why we are where we are at present and where we need to be going, we actually need to go right back. So I want to take you back to the night of the Last Supper. And in the accounts in the Gospel, it says that after they had sung the Psalms, they went out to the Mount of Olives. You'll be familiar with that verse from sacred scripture. So we know that Jesus himself, of course, was exposed to the liturgy of the temple, and the liturgy of the temple obviously included chanting in Hebrew, particularly of the Psalms, the 150 Psalms that make up the Psalter. We also know from New Testament evidence that the singing of both Psalms and other texts were obviously a very early feature of Christian worship. When we look at the New Testament, for instance, particularly the last book of the New Testament, the Revelation to St. John the Divine, we know that there are some texts in Revelation that are hymnic in nature. We also know that in some of Paul's writings, particularly the letter to the Colossians, but also the letter to the Philippians, that there are parts of the texts of those epistles that are hymnic. In other words, biblical scholars would suggest to us that some of that material was probably used in liturgical worship in the very early church. So I guess the point that I'm wanting to say is, right from the beginning, that the Christian community, when it gathered for liturgy, when it gathered for worship, for the celebration of the Eucharist, even in very primitive times, it would have had sung elements. I think that's a critical point to make, because many people now, I think sadly, go to a celebration of Mass on a Sunday, and while there might be some parts of the Mass sung and maybe a couple of hymns or songs, clergy now are very reluctant to chant. But there's very clear evidence that from the early church, liturgy was not recited in the sense of a spoken voice, but rather it was chanted.
Yeah.
And we see that tradition lives on in the Eastern Church. So, for instance, if you were to be exposed to the Eastern Orthodox churches, particularly the Greek Church, the Russian Church, all those derivative Orthodox churches, and by default, the churches that are in communion with the Holy See, that are what we refer to as Eastern churches. If you go to their liturgies, you will see that their liturgies are chanted, they're sung. So there's clear evidence that that the use of chanting in public worship has been a feature of particularly even the Latin Rite for centuries. But, and there's always the but, of course, the but is that we then, particularly after the Counter-Reformation, after the Council of Trent, when many priests, of course, celebrated a daily Mass by themselves at side altars in churches, provision was made for what was called a recited Mass. And a recited Mass was a read Mass. In other words, there was no chanting, but the priest, with probably the presence of an altar boy, would simply recite what was referred to as a low Mass. And the tradition was that there might be one Mass on a Sunday in a parish that was a missa cantata, a sung Mass.
Yeah.
And in better resource places like cathedrals and basilicas, there'd probably be what we would refer to as a solemn high Mass, with the presence of a priest, a deacon and a subdeacon and a whole array of liturgical ministers, and probably better resourced with a choir. And depending on what period of history we're talking about, there might be an orchestra or an organ or some other mode of instrumentation. So I think we've got to admit that part of the reason why, at least in the Latin Church, we have this custom of recited or said Masses began really way back in the 16th century. But the tradition prior to the 16th century was a sung tradition, a tradition where there was an extensive use of what we refer to as cantillation by the priest, in other words, chanting. And the notion that you would recite or say a Mass was probably foreign to, the medieval church. But became a fact after Trent, and lived on, of course, after the Second Vatican Council. Absolutely. So I think we could go back and say, well, and then going further back, of course, as you know, within the Roman tradition in particular, we see the emergence of a particular form of singing. and in fact you can access some of it online. Some of your viewers might want to do a search on what we refer to as Old Roman chant.
Yeah.
And Old Roman chant was the precursor of what came to be known as Gregorian chant, which was the principal way in which musically the church expressed itself from the 6th, 7th century all the way through until the early Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And that is unique to the Latin church. That form of singing is unique to the Latin church. And Old Roman chant was the original form of chant that was used in the churches of Rome.
Exactly.
In the 4th, 5th centuries. Yeah, very interesting.
It sounds very Byzantine. There's a lot of droning in Old Roman chant. It sounds somewhat Eastern. There's an Eastern influence on it.
Yes, yeah. And the reason why that is because there was an influx at various stages throughout the history. Of course, there was interaction between clergy of the East and the West. There wasn't this strong demarcation that appeared after the official break between the Church in the East and the West, sadly, which, as you know, came about. And then, of course, definitively after the destruction of Constantinople, by the forces that came against it. So it's yes, there was a good interrelationship between the two churches. So you would expect that there would be some elements of Eastern tonality that found its way into the Western tradition.
Excellent. And why are we moved in worship to sing, in principle, do you think, Father?
Well,
what is it about singing?
Yeah, there's a saying attributed to Saint Augustine, which I don't think really was from Saint Augustine, was the one who sings prays twice. And I think music for most people takes us out of ourselves. And even when you listen to contemporary or modern music, you find that music is able to express a whole gamut of feeling, of degrees of joy, sometimes of sorrow. Music has the capacity as an instrument to take us beyond ourselves in a spoken way. So even people who listen to their favourite music on a streaming service, when you ask them, even when they listen to contemporary music, to say, well, why do you like that song? Or why do you like that band? What is it that appeals to you? And people will say things like, well, I can really feel that. It sort of, I find it moves me, or, people will attribute the fact that music has the capacity as an idiom to penetrate into a person in a way that no other idiom is capable of doing. Now, does that then surprise us if we're wanting to express ourselves in terms of worship of God, that we would employ that idiom, which is capable of taking us outside of ourselves and exploring, if you like, the whole gamut of human emotion. Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing just to think about it, and how music clothes the liturgy, the liturgical action.
Yeah.
So let's move on to music. So from the 6th century onwards, we had Roman chant. When did Roman chant develop into Gregorian chant?
Well, that happened really over a period of time. Those people who specialise in chant would say that over the period of from about the 6th century, from the time of Gregory the Great, to whose name is affixed, the notion of Gregorian chant, probably reached its pinnacle in about the 10th or 11th century. So it was an evolving musical form. And of course, it was principally expressed within monastic communities in Europe. And of course, the Benedictine order were the great champions of chant, both men's and women's orders. So you had monks and nuns who were living in monasteries and convents throughout Europe, who would be singing the chant to both the divine office, to the psalms that were sung through the offices of the day, as well as for the celebration of Mass and for other liturgical celebrations. Originally, when you speak to experts on chant, they will tell you that the chant was written down. Most people, when they think about music, think now about a 5-line stave or staff. And of course, in Gregorian chant, it's a 4-line staff or stave. And but previous to that, they were just squiggles on a page before the invention of a 4-line stave. And people were able to sing because there were little markings put above the Latin text of what was being sung to indicate whether you lifted your voice in pitch or you lowered your voice in pitch.
Yeah.
So it's an extraordinarily interesting study, and there are people who've spent, their lifetime studying Gregorian chant from its earliest form right to its high point. And the invention of the stave, or the musical staff of 4 lines, and the development of what we refer to as neumes, that is the notation that accompanies Gregorian chant, made it much easier to sing. And I would still say now that it's easier to sing Gregorian chant in terms of following the notation than it is singing a modern 5-stave musical notation.
Excellent.
And most people in music would say that, would say it's actually easier to follow than modern notation.
Gregorian chant. And then fast forward to the 16th century, the concept of a red mass or a low mass developed. Do we know why we created this option to just say the low mass with no singing?
Yeah, sure. So we've got to go back now, jump back a few centuries to the beginning of what we say is the age of polyphony. That is the adding of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th voices that began in around about the 12th century. Examples of very early polyphony that you can listen to, again, people can access online, would be the music of somebody like Hildegard of Bingen, who was an outstanding religious woman of the early Middle Ages, and she also was a composer. But we begin to see the development of what we call polyphony that reached its high point in the 16th century with the wonderful music that was written by Palestrina and Vittoria. And so that complemented the chant. So what we had in the post-Reformation church was still the singing of chant, but we also had all these wonderful polyphonic mass settings and motets that were written in that period to help enhance the liturgy. But of course, as we discovered today, that requires resourcing. And the fact of the matter is that not everybody could resource a choir, could have the musical resources to be able to perform this music liturgically. So the bigger cathedrals, the bigger monasteries, the bigger abbeys, the bigger basilicas that may well have had benefactors might have been in a position to be able to resource music in this way. But your average village parish church didn't have that resourcing. And so with the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, of the Council of Trent, priests would have to rely on what they had. And in ordinary parishes, it reverted back to what we call a read or recited mass.
Mm-hmm. And it's so if we actually if we were to if we were to be thrown into the 12th century, 16th century, into an ordinary parish church, we wouldn't have all seen parish choir singing.
No. When you think about the villages across Europe at that time, that simply wouldn't have been the case. You might have had some people who might have had some interest in singing, but I think we've got to be honest to say that the music tradition of the church was carried by the monastic communities,
exactly,
and by the larger basilicas, cathedrals, and abbeys, who had the resources to be able to maintain and build the tradition.
And also the education as well, because they had to know the Latin to be able to sing it properly. And so they were they were the ones carrying it through and preserving it. And I can just imagine. The large numbers of monks or nuns singing Gregorian chant with that sandstone.
And of course it was a glorious time. And but I think we've got to be honest to say, well, while we had these marvelous centres of excellence and musical brilliance across Catholic Europe, it didn't actually drip down, if you like to use that phrase, into the ordinary village parishes.
Exactly. So let's now move. Can we move beyond the 16th century now into towards the Second Vatican Council?
Well, before we get there, unfortunately, George, we've got to jump through both the 18th century and the 19th century because they're very telling for us.
Yes, I can't jump across them.
So now we're entering into the time of the music of people like Haydn and Mozart, who wrote an enormous amount of music for the church, and what is known musically as the classical period. Now, again, if you were in a place like Salzburg or another big European city at that time, chances were that if you went to one of the big major churches, cathedrals, or abbeys, that for the solemn high mass on a Sunday morning, you might be treated to the music of Joseph Haydn with an orchestra and a choir. And what extensively happened was that they would sing a setting of the Mass from beginning to end, whilst in the background, the Mass was being celebrated. And the reason why a lot of that music that was written in the 18th century is not necessarily suitable for liturgical use today was because it was composed with a view that the music would be sung while the Mass was being said.
Exactly.
And
I just remember, my Sunday masses at the Latin Mass and the singing happening over while the priest reads the introit. They're singing the Kyrie. I can just imagine. Would have worked with more bigger pieces. of music. So
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And that's in fact what happened in those bigger places in Europe. Now, remember, we're talking about the big churches and cathedrals. We're not talking about your average parish church.
yeah,
Where if there was any singing, it might have been done by a religious community that was attached to the parish. But there was no expectation that the people themselves would sing. So there was never any expectation that people who were going to Mass would sing, that singing was the preserve of the choir, not the people. Now, in the 19th century, it got even more bizarre because in the 19th century, we have a tendency for church music that was being written at that time to almost mimic what was going on in the opera houses of Europe.
yeah.
So we get all these settings of the Mass that basically replicate the operatic form. And the response to that, interestingly, came from at the beginning of the 20th century by Pope Pius X, who published what's called a motu proprio, which is a document that a pope can issue, called Traili Solicitudini, in which he addressed the issue of people's participation in the Mass. And what many people don't know is that the phrase that was used in section 14 of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy from the Second Vatican Council, the phrase often quoted about the full, conscious and active participation of the people that we've spoken on in your previous session, that phrase was not original to the Second Vatican Council, but that phrase was a phrase of Pius X. Now, what was he on about? Well, what he wanted was for people to learn to sing the chants of the ordinary of the Mass. And what I mean by the ordinary of the Mass is I mean the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. What Pius X was calling for when he said he wanted conscious and full participation was he wanted ordinary Catholic folk to learn what we refer to as the chant masses. And he wanted them to be able to sing the chant masses at the Latin Mass. That's what he wanted. Because I think he could see what had happened in the 19th century was serving nobody except, underemployed opera singers in Europe.
And it became too much of a. Did it become too much of a theatrical performance?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes?
Yeah, it did. Yeah. And happily, almost all that repertoire has been consigned to the bin of history. Because a lot of it musically was very poor. But that was the trend. And we have Pius X to thank for encouraging people to return back to the simplicity of the Gregorian chant masses.
Exactly.
And that is why, George, you'll find that older Catholics in this country who lived in the pre-Vatican II church, many of them will know, for instance, the Mass that we refer to, the chant Mass we refer to as the Missa de Angelis.
Yeah.
Because it had quite common currency for ordinary Catholics. And that's as a result of what Pius X did.
Oh, that's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
And so, but was Gregorian chant ever declared as the official music, liturgical music of the Roman Rite prior to the Second
Yes,
Vatican
yes,
Council?
yes, it was, because we used to talk about music as being sacred and profane.
Mm-hmm.
And there was music that was designated sacred, and Gregorian chant was designated as being sacred music, that is suitable for use liturgically.
Mm-hmm.
Along with that, of course, they also added the great treasury of polyphony that came out of the 16th century that I was talking to you about earlier. So the music of Palestrina and Vittoria and so on. But the pride of place had always been given to the chant. And the reason why is because much of the chant, not all of it, but much of the chant is easily accessible. And particularly if you think about the chant masses, like the Missa de Angelus or the Mass Orbis Factor and so
Mm-hmm.
on, people could learn those mass settings and could learn how to sing them. Now, the proper of the Mass, the introit, the gradual, the offertory, the communion, and so on, they were very complicated, often pieces of chant, which
Mm-hmm.
could really only be sung realistically by a trained group of singers.
Mm-hmm.
You could have ordinary people in the pews learning how to sing a chant mass.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's very interesting. So, how did Gregorian chant develop? Do we have any understanding how it was written? Did it grow organic? Did it develop organic? I was saying grow
Oh
organic.
yes, it developed organically, and I think it probably reached its peak form somewhere around about the 11th or 12th century. So we're looking at old Roman chant from about 5th, 6th century, became Gregorian chant, and then developed over a period of 4 or 5 centuries, I think reaching its zenith in about the 12th century, in what we refer
Was it
to as.
developed in monasteries, or do we know
Yeah,
where?
in monasteries. No, the monasteries were, that was the place.
Excellent. So,
Monastic
yeah.
communities.
So it had
Yeah.
a great origin in the context of prayer, in the context of
Yes. Yeah.
solitude that he's
Yeah.
developed.
And monks would devote themselves, to the study of chant and to the writing out of liturgical books in which the chant would be notated. And you've all seen those, you've seen copies of illuminated manuscripts out of monastic libraries of that period. Highly
Exactly.
ornate, beautifully, beautifully done.
Yeah. If you go to London, there's you go to the UK or many other places in Rome, you can see a lot of notation, Gregorian notation.
Yes,
And let's talk about polyphony. What is polyphony?
yes.
So we have Gregorian chant, we have polyphony.
Yeah, well, as I was saying, so to easily explain it to people, some of your audience who might not necessarily be musicians, um, Gregorian chant operates on one single line of melody. But polyphony is when you then add other voices at another pitch from
Exactly.
the original melody. And the original form of polyphony was what we call two voices or two lines. And earlier on in our session, you talked to me about a drone,
Mm-hmm.
about the use of the drone, which is often one note that underpins the melody. So you've got a drone note at the bottom, if you like, being sung by the basses, and then you've got a melody that's being sung over the one note.
Mm-hmm.
That is the beginning of what we would say is polyphony. And
Excellent.
then finally, people began to understand the science of what we call harmony. What happens when you pitch one note above another at a particular musical interval creates a harmony. Then you can add a third voice on top of that, and then a fourth voice on top of that. And then ultimately what you get is four voices singing in harmony, with normally the upper voice maintaining the melody and the other voices adding to the richness of the melody by providing harmony underneath it. But it doesn't stop at four voices because, of course, you can write for 5 voices or 6 voices.
Mm-hmm.
And the most famous motet that came out of that period was written by an English composer called Thomas Tallis,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote a 40-part motet called Spem in Allium,
Wow.
where you had 40 voices. Now, if you want to hear polyphony of its zenith, then I would say to your audience, they need to find a recording of Spem in Allium by Thomas Tallis and listen to it. It's certainly available online. So they could get an experience of what polyphony at its highest form sounds like.
Exactly. That's about the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah.
And let's look at, are we ready to go to the Second Vatican Council?
Yeah, we are. We can get there now. That's fine. Let's go there.
Okay.
So the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy had some paragraphs pertaining to sacred music. And it said a number of things. One of the things was that Gregorian chant had pride of place in the Latin Rite, in the Roman Rite. It also commended the use of polyphony. It commended the use of pipe organs, and it also commended that choirs should be actively encouraged and maintained. It also said, interestingly enough, that popular religious songs could also find their way into use in the church. So it was giving a nod and a wink, I suppose you might say, particularly to religious songs that have developed over the centuries that are particular to a particular culture. So what happened? Well, here's what happened.
Because it doesn't seem that the Second Vatican Council invented much in Sacrosanctum Concilium, especially with regard to sacred music, apart from the addition of new songs.
Yeah.
It seems that it's in continuity with what's been practiced.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But let me explain to you why I think in some ways it's sort of
let's define what is the issue today with sacred music in the ordinary parish life.
Well, the issue today, firstly, rendering the liturgy in the vernacular meant that immediately you basically required an entirely new repertoire because chant and polyphony is in Latin.
Yeah.
So there have been a number, I think, of quite successful attempts to render chant in English and other vernacular languages. But that project took some time. And so when congregations of Catholics started worshipping in vernacular languages, they basically didn't have anything to sing because there was nothing written in that vernacular language. So composers began to write music, and happily in Australia we had some very competent liturgically minded musicians who wrote a whole body of very good liturgical music in English. But regrettably, what happened in the 1970s was that we got overrun by what was happening in the United States of America. And in the United States of America, this was a period of what we call the folk music era, where where there was a genre of contemporary modern music with people playing acoustic 6-string guitars with a single voice singing songs. And many people in the church in the United States of America thought, why don't we just take this music over into the church? That was why we began to see the appearance of people playing guitars in churches,
Yeah.
which had been unknown of before, but it was filling a gap. It was filling a gap. And the introduction of contemporary musical forms into the liturgy of the church, while at one level some people would argue that it was very pastorally successful, engaging people, what it ended up doing, of course, was completely and utterly upending the whole tradition of the singing of chant. Basically disappeared overnight. And except for places where choirs were maintained, the singing of Gregorian chant ostensibly disappeared.
What were the spiritual implications of that?
That's a very good question, George. The answer to that is I actually think I don't know, to be frank with you.
Neither do I.
I think the jury is still out on that. But I think what it did do was that it's led to an impoverishment of access, of people being able to access the tradition of the church over hundreds and hundreds of years. There is an example, of course, that many people don't know it, but in Australia in particular, when people sing the Lord's Prayer or the Our Father at Mass, they're of course singing chant, even if they don't realise that they're doing it. And in many instances, you'll often find that that's the best sung piece in the whole liturgy. It's when people sing the Our Father.
That is, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
Yeah. So the question is, what do we do? Now, I don't want to tip a complete bucket load. I think some of the early contemporary music that was written for the church was not worthy of liturgical music. And happily, a lot of that very early music that was written in the late 60s and 70s has disappeared. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful it's gone.
So it was just a cultural situation where people were just bringing what they felt like into the church.
Yeah.
They had a bad week at work, so they thought, we'll sing Kumbaya, my Lord, and and all those other contemporary songs, or I've heard secular music sung in church, in weddings, even, So they just brought it into the church, but luckily it's a lot of it has phased out at the moment.
Yes, a lot of it's gone. And then during the period of the 1990s, we had a more sophisticated contemporary music emerged largely out of the United States of America, that I refer to as the Broadway Sondheim School. Which was a lot more sophisticated and musically better written than the material that came out of the late 60s, 70s. But it was still of a genre that you would say, has this particular form of musical genre, does it have a place within the liturgical celebrations of the church? Now, some people would argue that the liturgy must enculturate, like it must embed itself in a culture. And that is true. And some of that music, I think, actually has worth and value. Although I think from a congregational point of view, it's very difficult to sing because a lot of it has very complicated rhythmic patterns in it. So it's not all that easy for a group of people to sing it. So I think...
should we also think about whether or not, to discern a piece of music, should we be thinking, has this developed organically from organic? So, because when we look at Gregorian chant, I mean, it seems to be it's something that developed in the monasteries. Over time, it was refined, it was used. And the fact it's dead music that isn't sung in a pub or a club or out in the secular means that it has its own unique identity for the liturgy.
Yes. Yes.
I think that's what a lot of young people today argue who attend, you know, cathedrals and traditional Latin masses and ordinariate masses and the more traditional. That's their argument, that if we have something that we've received, why don't we just stick to it?
Yeah. Well, indeed, I think largely, I think we are now beginning to recapture. Happily, we're recapturing a lot of music that apparently appeared to be lost. But again, you see, you've then got to look at once a culture becomes embedded in a worship community, it's very difficult to change it. So the fact of the matter is that we've got suburban parishes that live entirely on a diet of contemporary music that was written post-1980, and they know nothing of the tradition. And part of the issue that we're faced with is that, again, and it comes back to a point I was making to you much earlier about previous centuries, it just depends on how serious the church wants to be in resourcing the music. Because you can't do chant and you can't do polyphony unless you're resourced to do it and you've got people who are trained in knowing what they're doing. If you're relying on amateur musicians in suburban parish churches who've had some very basic training in music, they're not equipped to be able to do the music that comes from the tradition. So it just depends on how serious those who are in decision-making positions are in terms of saying we need to resource people better to be able to tap into the tradition. Obviously, you're not going to get ordinary suburban parish churches singing polyphony, and I wouldn't expect that. But we should be able to equip the people in our suburban parishes to sing chant. And that's not too big a ask, in my opinion.
Or Gregorian chants, such as a Missa de Angelis or Orbis Factor. That isn't too much out of reach.
No, it's not. No, it's not. And people with patience can learn to be able to sing those simple chant settings. And I think it would make a big difference to their experience of a liturgical celebration. Yeah.
Exactly.
So we've got a lot, again, as I said to you on the previous session, we've got a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah.
And it also means that we need to invest in training our younger musicians to know how to sing and teach the music.
Exactly.
And I'm happy to say that there are lots and lots and lots of young people who have a great interest in this musical tradition and are interested in beginning to know it and to know how to sing it and hopefully to be able to teach it to others.
I think we can be optimistic. I speak to these people week in, week out who are actually creating great initiatives to go to there's one initiative that's actually out there where they go around and they give workshops to parishes and their choirs. There's also the great initiative of Parramatta sending the assistant director of music out to the different parishes.
Well, that's all beginning to happen. And it's good news. And for instance, in the Catholic Worship Book #2, which was published a few years ago, which is the official church music resource in Australia, and I was the chairman of the editorial panel and the chairman of the National Liturgical Music Board for a number of years, we have a lot of chant in Catholic Worship Book 2, a lot. And we did that deliberately because we need to be able to make this available to people to be able to sing.
Excellent, excellent. And also, I just want to mention all these little initiatives of people who are just getting together and learning how to sing online as well. They're learning it online. And I know many people in their parishes starting to have one or two or three people to start to want to sing some sacred music. And several choirs are popping up as well. I know my wife sings in a choir, the choir of Benedict XVI. They sing for the Latin Mass, and they've sung before it in an ordinary parish in the Archdiocese of Sydney. There's a lot of initiative going on. There's a lot of interest from young people and all sorts of people to want to sing. So I think we can be optimistic. But to further this change, let's go into the 3 practical tools, because this is probably the most important part of the discussion is what can we do to propel this change forward so that we can see not only just somebody who walks into the Diocese of Parramatta and sees, okay, well, St. Patrick's Cathedral sets the standard for the music, and we also have the Latin Mass chaplaincy who says it, and maybe one other parish, but we want to see a variety of parishes growing in their sacred music and eventually to all the parishes. And
so what can we do? What practically can we do? Well, believe it or not, the Roman Missal has within it a setting of simple chants for the Mass that we put in there when we were doing the Missal. And the first practical thing we can do is to get people to become familiar with the chant setting that is actually in the Missal for the order of Mass, because it's printed there. It's a mixture of Mass 18 and Mass 15 of the chant masses in English. Very easily learned, and many people already know those settings.
Yes.
And so there's a very practical thing to do. The second practical thing that we can do is to encourage the use of the gospel acclamation to one of the Gregorian chants. Now, most people are used to what we call tone 6, which is the Easter Alleluia. Alleluia, Alleluia. Well, there are other ones that are just as simple. And so a second practical thing that we can do is to say, let's start singing the gospel acclamation to those simple Gregorian tones. That's the second thing that we can do. The third practical thing that we can do is that if you know somebody who's got a good voice, then you could encourage them to act as a cantor in a parish to lead the singing and get familiar with leading people in singing parts of the chant. I don't suggest that you do it all at once, but that you incrementally introduce the chant so that over time people become familiar with the chant. And what you'll find is that once they become familiar with the chant, their tolerance of music that isn't of the same quality will diminish.
And people pick it up. People, even young children as well, people pick up these, just these small little changes make a difference.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
They do.
Yeah, I think it's important. The third practical tool is very important, that there's so many people out there, friends that we have within each parish that can actually have great voices and can sing. And encouraging people to get involved, because we don't actually, do we need a minimum of people or just one person to get started for singing? We can just start with one person, right? And then also, if we wanted to start a little choir, you could start it with 2 people or 3 people that could sing, some Gregorian chant at the back of the church or the front or wherever it is in the loft. it doesn't really take 40 people or
No,
25
no,
people.
no, absolutely not. So there are little small things that we can do to actually gradually implement what the council had hoped for in terms of people being able to maintain the tradition. And over time, it will build. And there are three very practical little things that can be done.
Now, I just want to touch quickly before we end on the role of the parish priest as the leader and instigator in all this.
Yeah.
What can the parish priests who are listening, what can they do to take action to initiate this? Because often it's a parish priest who understands and values Gregorian chant as a primary place in the Roman Rite and other sacred music can really propel things forward. But what can they do from the?
What can they do? Well, I think it's a generational thing. I think you'll find that clergy have been trained in about the last 15 to 20 years, have had instilled in them a love of and exposure to chant. That generation of clergy who were trained in the 1970s and 80s had no such exposure. So they're going to be a bit difficult to persuade. But certainly the last 20 years, we've got a cohort of clergy now who were very well trained in chant and get it. And they're going to be a lot more amenable for the chant to be introduced than clergy who were probably trained in the 70s and 80s who've had no exposure because it just wasn't part of their formation. Exactly. So I think again, we will find that as the generations go, the young men who are now being trained are all being trained in the area of chant.
Exactly. So it's a parallel with the laity who are now interested in the chant.
And that will continue. That will continue, George. Yeah. So it'll build. So I'm feeling quite optimistic about it.
Yeah, I am also. Yeah, but the parish priest can encourage people and say, "Look, why don't we start singing? If there's an existing choir of 3, 4, 5 people, could they take the step and say, well, can we let's start adding some Gregorian chant or some simple tones?"
Absolutely, because I think you would find that most clergy are very keen to have anybody who will offer in music at all. And I think if you had 4 or 5 people came together and said, look, we'd like to form a little schola and start singing English chant masses, most parish priests would be very happy to have that. So I think you'll find that would be very well received. Yeah.
Excellent. So moral of today's discussion is find 1, 2, or 3 people. You can even start with 1 or 2. Or start your own little choir. Learn the chants. Go online. Contact different organizations, and you can start it and start singing for these masses. It's
absolutely
it's a quick. It really, it's not going to take 40 people. It's just a few people. You can start a schola and we can get started. Excellent, Father. What's your final words of encouragement for our listeners here today?
Well, my final word would be, if you don't know about the tradition, search it out online. Listen to the way that the church has sung in the past. Because it helps inform us the way that we should be singing into the future.
Excellent. And we can leave us with your blessing, Father, to end the show.
Yes. Thank you, George. Let us pray that we be aided by the prayers of all the saints, and especially of our Blessed Mother. And may Almighty God bless us all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you for tuning into the Catholic Toolbox, the Art of Practical Catholicism. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast at the Catholic Toolbox, wherever you get your podcasts. Till next week, I'm your host and founder, George Manassa. God bless, take care, and take action.
In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity.